Most people assume they already know what the Demiurge is. A bad god, a false creator, some kind of cosmic mistake responsible for the broken world you're living in. That's the version that made it through, the simplified, defanged version that even some academic circles have agreed to tolerate. But that version left something out, something the people who actually understood this system spent their lives trying to reach, something the texts call an exit. Not a metaphor for dying, not a poetic description of enlightenment, an actual operational framework for breaking the Demiurge's hold on your perception from the inside while you're still alive, still breathing, still here. And for 7 days, I did nothing but work with it. Every morning before anything else touched my attention, every night before sleep took it. 7 days of running the practices the Gnostic texts describe, not reading about them, not theorizing about them, running them. What happened wasn't what I expected, and I want to be careful about how I tell you this, because the easy version sounds like a self-help testimonial, and I'm not interested in giving you that. What happened was structural. Something in the way I was processing reality shifted, not dramatically, not in a flash of light, but in a way that hasn't reversed. And that's what we're going to talk about. This is what the Demiurge's exit door actually is, why it was hidden, and what 7 days of using it actually does to a person. I'm Daniel, and this is Gnostic Library. Let's start with what the Demiurge actually is. Not the cartoon version, but the technical one. Because if you don't understand the architecture of the prison, you can't find the door. In the Gnostic cosmological system, specifically as laid out in the Apocryphon of John, one of the primary texts discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, the Demiurge is not simply an evil god. He is a god who doesn't know he's not the highest god. That distinction matters enormously. The text describes him as Yaldabaoth, a being who arose from a mistake within the divine fullness, what the Gnostics called the pleroma, and who, upon finding himself alone, declared, "I am a jealous God, and there is no other God beside me." The Apocryphon of John records that statement and immediately follows it with this. By saying this, he revealed to the angels who were with him that there is another God. Because a truly supreme being doesn't declare it. Certainty doesn't announce itself. Now here's where it gets cosmically significant. The Demiurge didn't just create a world. He created a world with a specific architectural feature. Humans were made to contain something he himself couldn't generate. A divine spark. A fragment of genuine pleromatic light that was breathed into Adam without Yaldabaoth fully understanding what he was doing. The Pistis Sophia describes this as the light power hidden within the material human form. He built the prison, but he accidentally installed a window. And then he installed guards, the Archons. Described across multiple Nag Hammadi texts as the administrators of the material realm, not horned demons in a fantasy sense, but structural forces that maintain the boundaries of the prison. Planetary rulers in some texts, thought forms in others. What matters is their function. They are the mechanisms by which the divine spark inside you stays unrecognized. Not through force, but through distraction. Through identification with the body, with personality, with fear, with need. The Gospel of Philip puts it this way: ignorance is the mother of all evil. Not sin, not transgression, ignorance. And this is the part most people miss when they read the Gnostic texts casually, when they treat it like interesting mythology and nothing more. That's not Gnosis, that's just a library card. The Gnostic system isn't describing a historical event that happened once to a first human. It's describing your current condition, right now. The divine spark inside you is real, present, and unrecognized, not because it's hidden from you by an external force, but because your entire perceptual architecture has been organized around the Demiurge's version of reality. The material, the urgent, the mortal, the fearful. I spent a long time sitting with that idea before it landed. I remember the first night I actually read the Apocryphon of John straight through, not skimming, not summarizing, and I got to the section describing the Archons encoding forgetfulness into the human form, and something in me went cold. Not with fear, with recognition. Because I had experienced that forgetfulness. I had lived inside that forgetfulness for years while calling it normal life. So where is the door? The Gnostic answer is precise. The door is Gnosis. Not knowledge about the system, not intellectual familiarity with the texts. Gnosis, in the original Greek sense, direct, interior, experiential recognition of your own nature. The recognition that the spark is real, is you, and is not subject to the Demiurge's jurisdiction. The trimorphic protonoia, one of the most extraordinary texts in the entire Nag Hammadi library, frames it this way. The divine voice descends 3 times into the world not to rescue humanity from outside, but to awaken recognition from inside. I am the one who dwells in the light, the text declares. I move in every creature. Not a God above you, a presence within you that has been speaking all along, and that you've been too loud, too distracted, too Archon managed to hear. I personally think this is the most systematically underrated insight in all of ancient religious literature. The idea that the divine doesn't come to you from above, it surfaces from within you when the noise is cleared. Every major mystical tradition touches this. The Gnostics built a precise operational map of it, and then that map was burned. When I say I tried the Demiurge's exit door for 7 days, I want to be precise about what that means, because I'm not talking about a ritual, a meditation technique I invented, or a self-improvement challenge. I'm talking about working with the specific practices that the Nag Hammadi texts describe, not what modern interpreters say the texts imply, the texts themselves. The first practice is what the Gnostics called the recognition of the light spark. This isn't visualization. The Gospel of Truth, a text attributed in tradition to Valentinus, who came within a single vote of becoming Bishop of Rome in the 2nd century, 1 vote, think about what that would have meant, describes the condition of the unrealized soul as being lost in a fog, reaching for shapes that dissolve on contact. The opposite of that fog is not concentration, it's recognition. Specifically, before engaging with any thought, any sensation, any perception, you pause at the threshold of awareness itself, and you ask not, what am I aware of, but who is aware? You don't answer, you rest in the asking. I started this on a Tuesday morning, 5 minutes before I looked at my phone, before I heard anyone else's voice, before I built the normal architecture of the day. 5 minutes of that question. Who is aware? The second day, it lasted 8 minutes before my mind pulled back into the ordinary current. The third day, something happened that I want to describe carefully. The question stopped being a question. It became by. And I'm going to choose this word precisely. By a position. Not a thought about the position itself. And from that position, the ordinary concerns of the morning, the unread messages, the schedule, the low-grade anxiety that usually assembled itself before breakfast appeared at a distance. Not suppressed, not ignored. At a distance. As if I were watching them from slightly outside the usual vantage point. Now here's where it gets cosmically significant. A viewer named Morella left a comment under my video on the Archons that stopped me when I read it. She wrote, "I've been doing something like this for years without knowing it had a name or a tradition behind it. Every morning I sit before the day begins and I ask myself, who is behind the one asking? I thought I invented it. Finding out the Gnostics had a whole cosmology built around this exact move made me feel like I wasn't crazy. I read that and I felt what I imagine confirmation feels like when it comes from an unexpected direction. Not from a text, from someone in the comments who had arrived at the same internal address through a completely different path. That's not an accident. That's recognition. That's what this practice produces when people actually work with it. The second Gnostic practice the texts point toward is what I'll call the Archon audit, because the Nag Hammadi texts don't give it a simple English name, but the function is identifiable across multiple documents. The Pistis Sophia describes the soul's passage through the Archon-administered realms as requiring something specific. The soul must be able to name each Archon, understand its function, and declare itself not subject to it. In the original text, this is framed as an afterlife process. But, and this is the move that changes everything, the Gnostic logic doesn't restrict this to after death. Gnosis is available now, which means the audit is available now. Practically, this is what days 4 through 6 of my 7-day period involved. Each day, I identified one dominant psychological pattern, one recurring compulsion, fear, or identity grip, and I looked at it not as something I was fighting or managing, but as something I was temporarily identified with, an Archon function. A structure I had agreed to live inside without realizing I'd agreed to it. And I named it. Not dramatically, quietly. The way you'd note the name of a town you're passing through rather than one you're living in. Day 5 was the hardest. I want to be honest about that. The pattern I sat with on day 5 was one I had organized a significant portion of my adult life around. Naming it, really naming it, not performing the naming, produced something that felt uncomfortably close to grief. Not breakdown, grief. The specific variety that comes when you recognize you've been carrying something heavy for a long time and only now noticed the weight. The exegesis on the soul, another Nag Hammadi text that doesn't get nearly the attention it deserves, describes this phase as the soul beginning to remember its original face. Not a pleasant image necessarily. Remembering can hurt. The text doesn't flinch from that, and neither should you. As I covered in my video on what the Gnostic Jesus actually taught, the tradition consistently frames transformation not as comfortable ascension, but as a kind of structured disassembly. The false architecture coming apart so the original structure can be felt again. That's not metaphor. That's a functional description of what the 7 days produced. Day 7 was different. I want to be careful about how I describe this because the line between genuine interior shift and narrative self-congratulation is thin, and I'm not interested in performing awakening for an audience. Here is what I can report factually. On the morning of day 7, during the light spark recognition practice, the question, who is aware, didn't collapse back into ordinary thinking as it had every previous morning. It held. For what I estimate was somewhere between 12 and 15 minutes, there was a quality of awareness present that I can only describe this way. It wasn't pointed at anything. It wasn't building toward anything. It was self-sufficient in a way that ordinary consciousness isn't. Ordinary consciousness is always hungry for the next input, the next stimulus, the next confirmation that you exist. This wasn't hungry. It was already full. I'm not claiming this was enlightenment. I'm telling you what happened. And I'm telling you because it maps precisely onto what the Gnostic texts describe Gnosis producing. The Apocryphon of John says the one who receives Gnosis will not taste death. Not physical immortality. The death they're describing is the perpetual dying of a consciousness that never recognizes its own nature. Always consuming, always afraid, always subject to the Archon-administered cycle of desire and loss. Now here is the institutional stakes layer, because this is not just a personal story. The reason these practices were not preserved in mainstream religious tradition is not because they were false. It is because they are incompatible with institutional religious control. You cannot manage a congregation of people who recognize their own divine nature. You cannot extract obedience from someone who has experienced, directly and internally, that they are not fundamentally a sinner in need of a mediator, but a spark of the pleroma temporarily occupying a material vehicle. Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, wrote his famous treatise Against Heresies around 180 CE, specifically to dismantle Gnostic communities. He didn't argue that their practices produced no results. He argued that their results came from the wrong source. Think about that rhetorical move. He couldn't say it doesn't work. He had to say it works, but it's dangerous. When an institution attacks a teaching not because it's demonstrably false, but because it's structurally threatening, you are looking at evidence of suppressed truth. The Nag Hammadi texts were buried around 367 CE, the same year Athanasius of Alexandria issued his famous Easter letter defining the canonical New Testament and instructing that all other books be destroyed. Not coincidence, coordination. Someone put those texts in a jar and buried them in the Egyptian desert rather than burn them, because they understood that what they contained was too important to lose. They were right. It took 16 centuries, but the jar was found. And what it contained wasn't mythology. It was a map. A map of the prison, its guards, the window the Demiurge accidentally installed, and the precise internal movement required to look through it. The movement is not complicated. It requires no priest, no sacrament, no institution, and no permission. Can't exactly put a collection plate in front of someone's internal awakening, just saying. Here is what 7 days produced that I can measure concretely. A reduction in what I can only call automatic reactivity. The speed at which external events, irritations, disappointments, anxieties colonize my attention has measurably slowed. Not because I've gotten better at suppressing them, because there is now a gap, however small, between the event and my identification with the reaction. That gap is what the Gnostics were pointing at. That gap is where the spark lives. That gap is what the Archons spend every moment of your ordinary existence trying to close. 7 days doesn't make you free, but it makes the architecture visible in a way it wasn't before. And once you can see the architecture, you cannot unsee it. The Demiurge's power isn't in force, it's in invisibility. In the assumption that the prison's walls are just the shape of reality. The moment you see a wall is a wall, not the edge of the world. Something irreversible has happened. You were never made to live entirely inside the Demiurge's construction. The light spark inside you has been trying to surface through every moment of beauty, every inexplicable recognition, every experience you've had that the ordinary categories of your life couldn't quite contain. That wasn't random. That was signal. Stop waiting for an external door. The exit was built into you. All Gnosis ever asks is that you look. If this video resonated with you, let me know by commenting, "I understood it."